Mary Tudor, also known as Mary I, holds the distinction of being England's first female monarch to rule in her own right. At the dawn of her reign, she was a beloved and celebrated member of the royal family, and the future seemed bright for her rule. But what led to her infamous transformation into Bloody Mary? Was this title justified, or has history misjudged her? Born on February 18, 1516, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, Mary was not her mother Catherine of Aragon's first child, but she was the only one to survive infancy. Her father, Henry VIII, had long hoped for a male heir, but a healthy royal child was still considered a blessing. Catherine had endured years of heartbreak, 4 miscarriages, a stillbirth, and the devastating loss of a baby boy at just 2 months old. The weight of Henry's expectations, as well as those of the entire kingdom, must have weighed heavily on her. Mary was baptised into the Catholic faith just 3 days after her birth, a religious foundation that would later shape her rule. Any initial disappointment Henry felt at having a daughter rather than a son was tempered by his confidence that a male heir would eventually follow. However, Catherine, who had seen 6 of her children perish, likely did not share his optimism. To her, Mary was the rightful heir to England's throne. Despite being deeply cherished, Mary's early years were shaped by the realities of royal politics and the expectations of her father's reign. Like most royal children, Mary Tudor was not raised in close proximity to her parents. Instead, her household became her family, with one figure standing out as her greatest influence, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. In May 1520, Margaret was appointed as Mary's lady governess, a role she fulfilled with both devotion and expertise. As a close friend of Catherine of Aragon and a woman well versed in courtly etiquette, Margaret was the ideal mentor for a young princess, instilling in Mary the values of nobility, discipline, and grace. Although Mary is often remembered for her later religious fervour, her childhood was far from austere. Like her younger sister Elizabeth, she was an intelligent and gifted child. Contrary to the image of a sombre upbringing, Mary delighted in courtly entertainments such as plays and masques, with a significant portion of her household budget dedicated to festive celebrations, particularly at Christmas. Music was another of her passions. By the age of 4, she had already mastered the virginals, an early form of the harpsichord, impressing a group of French envoys sent by King Francis I to assess the young princess. As she grew, Mary received a rigorous education, learning to read and write Latin while also studying French and her mother's native Spanish. Henry VIII admired his daughter's intellect and refined tastes, but his primary concern was securing her political value. Royal princesses were powerful bargaining tools, and Henry wasted no time in leveraging Mary's status. At just 2.5 years old, she was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, though the arrangement expected her to remain in England until she reached the age of 14. It is unlikely that Henry VIII ever seriously intended for Mary to marry Francis, the Dauphin of France. The engagement was more a diplomatic manoeuvre to secure peace between England and France. After 3 years, the contract was dissolved, and Mary was promised to her cousin, Charles V of Spain, 22 years her senior. Despite the age gap, Charles's visit to England was a joyous occasion. When he arrived to meet his young bride-to-be, he was warmly received. It was the only time Mary ever met him, but she always remembered him as a kind, fatherly figure. However, like her previous engagement, this betrothal was eventually annulled by mutual agreement with Charles. This cycle of political betrothals became a defining theme in Mary's life, continuing through her childhood and adulthood. While royal daughters were often used as political pawns, Mary had so many suitors, it was impossible to remember them all. Each time she returned to court, another potential marriage was suggested, only for the arrangement to fall apart. By this time, Henry VIII accepted what Catherine of Aragon had realised. Mary was likely his only heir. During negotiations for her marriage to Charles, Henry remarked that, as his only legitimate child, Mary was of immense value, expecting a substantial dowry from the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1525, at 9, Mary was sent to the Welsh Marches. She was given a council at Ludlow Castle, a privilege of the Prince of Wales, though her authority remained uncertain. Despite political uncertainty, she was praised for her intelligence, grace, and composure. Mary Tudor was known for her charming personality, more outgoing than her reserved mother, yet far less boisterous than her commanding father. She was well liked at court, where her presence was always warmly received. Her servants adored her, and she showed them unwavering loyalty, ensuring their lifelong support. Her devotion to her parents was equally strong. In 1528, she wrote to Cardinal Wolsey, expressing gratitude for his help in allowing her to spend a month with them. Despite her privileged upbringing, Mary's world began to unravel in her teenage years, not due to her marriage, but the crumbling state of her parents' relationship. For much of her childhood, she was shielded from tensions between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. But at 15, she was forced to confront the painful truth. Her father was determined to replace her mother. The catalyst arrived in 1522 with Anne Boleyn, fresh from France. By the mid-1520s, she had captivated Henry's attention. Anne's influence was divisive. Some saw her as a scheming seductress, while others admired her culture, education, and reformist views. For Mary, Anne was her enemy. The hatred went beyond a broken family. Under Anne's influence, Mary was distanced from her father, separated from her mother during her illness, and stripped of her title as princess, reduced to Lady Mary. Her emotional and physical well-being suffered greatly. From then on, she refused to acknowledge Anne as anything more than that woman. These experiences hardened Mary, cementing her distrust of Protestantism, hatred of the Boleyns, and belief that her parents' marriage was valid. What she may not have realised was that Henry had been contemplating divorce long before Anne entered the picture. Had it not been Anne Boleyn, it would have been someone else. That was the conclusion Mary reached as she watched her mother, Catherine of Aragon, maintain her dignity despite the storm behind the scenes. Mary came to believe Henry's conscience was the driving force behind his decision to separate from his wife. Justifying the divorce by claiming Catherine's marriage to his late brother was invalid. Catherine, however, insisted her first marriage had never been consummated. From this painful experience, Mary learned a valuable lesson. A clear conscience was the most important thing, for herself and her relationship with God. But this belief would lead to countless struggles in the years ahead. As if losing her status as princess wasn't enough, Mary had her entire world stripped away. Her household was dissolved, her servants dismissed, and her mentor, the Countess of Salisbury, was sent away. Mary was forced to join the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, at Hatfield House, a devastating blow. Though she found common ground with Elizabeth, she refused to recognise Anne Boleyn as queen, a sentiment that would affect her later treatment of Elizabeth. Her defiance enraged Henry, and over the next 4 years, their relationship deteriorated. But the most heartbreaking moment came in 1536, when Catherine passed away. Mary was denied the chance to be with her mother in her final moments, and the loss left a deep mark on her once joyful spirit. The vibrant princess had faded into sorrow and isolation. Mary Tudor's world had been shattered. Once a cherished princess, she was now cast aside as the illegitimate daughter of the king, truly alone after her mother's death. Shortly after Catherine of Aragon's passing, Henry VIII, frustrated with Anne Boleyn's inability to produce a son, turned against her. In a notorious plot, Henry and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, orchestrated Anne's downfall. Accused of adultery, incest and plotting against Catherine and Mary, Anne was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where she spiralled into hysteria, providing Cromwell with what he needed to seal her fate. Whether guilty or not, Anne was executed by beheading on May 19, 1536. Though little is known about Mary's immediate reaction, it likely felt like a triumph to see Anne gone. She may have assumed she would be restored to her rightful place as Princess of England, but no restoration came. Henry demanded that Mary acknowledge him as supreme head of the Church of England. After resisting, Mary was forced, under immense pressure, to sign a document recognising his authority and acknowledging her parents' marriage as unlawful and incestuous. It was a devastating betrayal of her mother's memory, but Mary understood that without compliance, she had no future. This ordeal taught her a vital lesson. Power could force submission, and when she became queen, she would use that power to bend others to her will. Mary Tudor learned a harsh lesson. Only the monarch could decide what was best for the kingdom. This realisation likely deepened her resentment toward the Church of England, leaving a lasting mark on her conscience. Everything she had once stood for had been compromised in her quest for acceptance from her father and a peaceful life. Though Mary was welcomed back to court, she was still considered illegitimate, like her half-sister Elizabeth. Both were restored to the line of succession in 1544. Suitors came forward, but none of the proposals materialised. In 1541, Mary suffered another blow when her father ordered the execution of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. Margaret, who had been like a second mother to Mary, was accused of involvement in a Catholic plot. The execution was horrific, with the executioner failing to kill her quickly. Mary, already burdened by loss, must have felt numb with grief. Henry VIII's death in 1547 ended an era. Publicly, Mary mourned, but privately she felt relief. Her father had treated her cruelly, and now she had some independence. However, the throne passed to her younger half-brother, Edward VI. As a woman in a male-dominated society, the idea of a female ruler was unclear. Mary often must have wondered how she would have ruled had she been given the chance. Instead, she found herself at odds with Edward, who sought to enforce Protestant reforms, while Mary clung to her Catholic faith, holding Mass in her own home. This act would set the stage for the battles ahead. When Edward VI ordered Mary to abandon her Catholic faith, she refused and sought support from her cousin, Emperor Charles V. For much of Edward's reign, Mary stayed away from court, preferring the solitude of her estates. However, when she did attend, Edward publicly humiliated her, rebuking her for defying his religious reforms during a Christmas event in 1550, which reduced her to tears. Despite this, Mary's resolve remained unbroken. Edward died on July 6, 1553, at 15, likely from tuberculosis. However, he had excluded Mary from the line of succession, naming Lady Jane Grey and her sisters as heirs. Before his death, Mary had been summoned to London, but sensing a trap, she fled to her estates in East Anglia, where she had wealth and a loyal army. The region was a Catholic stronghold, and Mary remained a popular figure. On July 12th, after Jane was proclaimed Queen, Mary gathered forces at Framlingham Castle. Support for Jane quickly crumbled, and on July 19th, the Privy Council declared for Mary, deposing Jane. Mary claimed her throne not through war, but through her popularity and royal authority, understanding that no monarch could rule England without the people's will. On August 3, 1553, Mary triumphantly rode into London with Elizabeth by her side, displaying unity and reinforcing the legitimacy of her claim. The rightful heir had finally taken her place. Although Mary and Elizabeth presented a united front, their relationship was strained. Mary deeply distrusted her sister due to her Protestant beliefs. Once crowned queen on October 1st, 1553, Mary swiftly established her rule. One of her first actions was to release two key allies from the Tower of London, Thomas Howard, who joined her Privy Council, and Stephen Gardiner, her Lord Chancellor. Both were staunch Catholics, signalling Mary's intent to restore Catholicism to England. Mary genuinely believed she was saving her people's souls, though often portrayed as a religious fanatic. Initially, she took a measured approach, issuing a proclamation that she would not force her subjects to convert, understanding that many had been raised Protestant. However, by September 1553, leading Protestant church leaders were imprisoned, and laws were enacted to declare her parents' marriage valid, repeal Edward VI's reforms, and restore England's pre-Reformation church doctrine. Parliament also repealed Henry VIII's religious laws. For Mary, this was a divine mission, earning her the title Defender of the Faith. Mary also worked to stabilise England's economy, issuing new gold and silver coins to curb inflation and using her wealth to repay Henry VIII and Edward VI's debts. Despite her focus on religion, Mary showed mercy, recognising that Lady Jane Grey was not the mastermind behind the plot to place her on the throne. She attempted to save Jane by sending priests to persuade her to convert, but Jane refused to renounce her faith. Mary's refusal to execute Jane Grey stemmed from her deep sense of kinship and mercy. Jane's mother, Frances Brandon, had been a close cousin and friend to Mary, and she had previously shown mercy to Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk. However, political pressures mounted, with advisors urging that Jane's execution was necessary for the security of Mary's reign. Despite this, Mary hesitated. When news of her potential marriage to Philip of Spain surfaced, many feared the alliance would jeopardise England's independence, leading to Wyatt's rebellion. After quelling the revolt, Mary reluctantly agreed to Jane's execution, along with her husband Guildford Dudley. Though politically necessary, the decision was painful for Mary, who later sought to aid Frances and her remaining daughters. Another challenge was securing an heir. At 37, marriage was seen as crucial. This tradition passed from her grandmother, Isabella of Castile, to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and to Mary. Mary believed marriage was as much a royal duty as ruling. Her cousin, Charles V, suggested his son, Philip of Spain, as a match. Upon seeing his portrait, Mary reportedly fell in love. However, many of her counsellors opposed the match, fearing foreign influence. To address this, Mary drew up a marriage contract, ensuring Philip would not control England's lands. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain on July 25, 1554, was politically motivated to strengthen Catholicism in both England and Spain. Although Philip was initially reluctant, the marriage proceeded for strategic reasons, with key conditions. Philip could not act as King of England without Mary's consent, and Parliament could only be convened by both during her lifetime. They retained control over their realms, similar to her grandparents' arrangement. While the marriage offered political benefits for Spain, tensions soon arose. In September 1554, Mary believed she was pregnant, fueling hopes of securing her bloodline on the throne. By April 1555, Elizabeth was released from house arrest to witness the birth of the anticipated heir. However, months passed without a child, and it became clear that Mary's supposed pregnancy was a false one, likely due to her intense desire for an heir. This caused significant emotional distress and worsened her mental health. Adding to her strain, Philip left soon after to command his armies in the Low Countries. Though Mary maintained composure during their farewell, she privately broke down in tears, revealing the burden she carried as queen. In December 1554, still reeling from the false pregnancy, Mary wrote a statement to her council, urging universities and churches to follow Catholic doctrine strictly and for heretics to be punished, demonstrating her commitment to restoring Catholicism in England. Mary I's reign is often remembered for the execution of around 300 Protestants during the Marian persecutions. These brutal burnings at the stake are widely condemned, but it's essential to consider the broader historical context. During her reign, burning heretics was a common punishment, with both Protestant and Catholic heretics executed this way across Europe. While tragic, her actions were not unique among monarchs. Mary's approach to the death penalty mirrored that of her father, Henry VIII, who was responsible for tens of thousands of executions, with estimates up to 72,000. Even Elizabeth I, Mary's successor, ordered the execution of around 450 people in a northern uprising and 130 Catholic priests who refused to renounce their faith. Thus, Mary's execution of heretics was horrifying, but not an outlier for the time. Burning at the stake was seen as a way to physically represent eternal punishment for those who did not repent, serving both as a deterrent and a means of saving souls, which Mary may have justified. However, Elizabeth's reign amplified the persecution for propaganda purposes, portraying Mary as a fanatic and Elizabeth as tolerant. Despite this, some of Mary's punishments were particularly cruel. such as the execution of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. On March 21st, 1556, Cranmer was burned at the stake, declaring himself a martyr. His death became a symbol for Protestant resistance to Mary's reign, deepening divisions in England. Mary I's reign was marked by unpopular decisions that fueled anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish sentiments. The brutal burnings of Protestants, meant to preserve Catholicism, sparked resentment, with victims revered as martyrs. Mary was warned that continuing these policies could provoke revolt, but she pressed on, especially since she had no heir and knew Elizabeth, her Protestant sister, was the next in line. External pressures compounded her struggles. In March 1557, Philip II of Spain saw England's support in a war against France. By June, England was at war, and when Thomas Stafford attempted an unsuccessful invasion, it led to conflict with France, which was unpopular. Poor harvests and famine worsened the situation, and Spanish refusal to share trade routes deepened resentment toward her marriage. Mary's belief that she was pregnant in early 1558 led to disappointment when no child was born. By then she had accepted Elizabeth as her successor. In summer 1558 her health deteriorated, and by October she was too weak to fulfill her duties. She added a note to her will, acknowledging Elizabeth as Queen. Mary I passed away on November 17th, 1558, possibly from uterine cancer, ending England's first undisputed female reign. Her legacy was complex. Devotion to Catholicism led to over 300 Protestant deaths, and her reign was influenced by famine and instability. Though her punishment of heretics was horrific, it reflected the times, and her reign was defined by personal and political struggles.